I'm Cass Irvin, and I'm a Kentucky artist. I would consider myself a teacher.
Artist educator? Teacher?
I educate any way I can, and art proves to be a very good way. I never wanted to be a teacher. I always said I will never be a teacher because my mother was a teacher, her sisters were teachers. My dad's sisters were either teachers or they married preachers, and preachers' wives end up teaching. So I always swore I would never be a teacher, but then I, like many other people, had that one teacher who made a difference in my life, a huge difference in my life. And that's when I decided I would be a teacher. And I have to say, because of my disability and my family background, art was always a part of my life. Inaccessibility's been a problem, but I guess I've been lucky because in the early days, the art things I went to, either I was small enough I could be toted around, or things were accessible enough, going in back entrances and sitting in the aisle instead of being put in a regular chair in the theater. So art's been a part of my life forever. And in the schools, when I grew up, it's not that way so much today, but when I grew up, we all had art in the schools. We would go to actors theater, or we would go to the opera. It was just a part of what you did as a part of your education. And of course, you know, we performed in schools, and we had our own little art shows in schools. So it's always been a part of my life. And I think when I first got involved with disability and I realized so many disabled people hadn't had those opportunities because they didn't have a family that was participating in art, or they didn't know how to deal with the accessibility issues, I think that's when I got involved with wanting art to be accessible for everybody. The thing with art, I mean, when I started out as an artist, I considered myself a visual artist because when I was in college, I took painting classes and I was pretty good at it. And I was a visual artist, but when you think of what your career is supposed to be, or how you're going to get along financially in the world, you have to decide what you can do in life. And I decided I wanted to be a writer. In those days, I thought more of like writing columns or just experiences and being maybe in a newspaper. But I realized once I got involved with disability advocacy that even though you could teach people about all the laws, unless you explain to them in humanistic terms or tell them a story about disability and discrimination, then they could understand it. That's when I realized if I could tell certain stories in a certain way, hopefully effective way, that people would go, oh, I never thought of it that way. I've never realized that, and now I can look at things differently. So to me, you know, I would like to say I'm a storyteller, but as kind of lofty terms, but I do believe that in my stories, I do try to explain issues in a more benign sort of way, and hopefully sometimes even entertaining. As an artist, though, I do have to say, it was difficult when I started writing disability stories because mine are not the courageous type, overcoming type stories most people would look at as being disability stories. And it's not that I always have some disability in my stories because that's my experience. But I think as an artist, the most important time in my life was when the Kentucky Foundation for Women gave me a grant for writing. Because to me it was the first real indication, even though I'd been published some, that I was a mainstream writer, that I was a legitimate writer. The Disability Rag was a civil rights publication of the disability rights movement. It started in 1980. The first month, 25 copies went out, 4 pages. Somebody that we know with a visual disability wrote to us and said, I don't see how you could make the print any smaller. But in those days, you know, we were doing it all by ourselves, and so we were doing the best we could, and nobody was paying for it. We sent out 25 copies. We told people It was going to be free for a while, and I think it was free for about 6 months. Then we started asking people, and it went out to only people that we knew, you know. And the reason it was started originally was, in those days, there wasn't mass transportation accessible. There wasn't the internet, believe it or not. And people couldn't gather together very well. A publication which would come to your house was going to hopefully tie people together. After the first 6 months, we wrote to people. We told them we were going to charge them $5 a year to subscribe. There was 12 issues in those days. It was interesting to us because disabled people subscribed. And some disabled people even gave us money so other people could subscribe. It thrived for many years. Small circulation, we figured at one point our pass-along readership was 25,000, and in the 80s, that's not so bad. In the years that I wrote for the rag, sometimes I wrote stories. In the years I wrote for the rag, sometimes I used a pen name. I found that people liked reading about other disabled people and disability stories, at least the audience I was working for. And I realized that in my writings, as in any art, you want to affect people, that they could learn about disability oppression, disability discrimination, prejudice, and the good things, like our heroes, Franklin Roosevelt and Stephen Hawking, people who were accomplished. The interesting thing about the rag is that it chronicled our history. We sort of looked at it like we were a microcosm and we wanted people to know what was going on. A lot of disability writers today started out writing for the disability rag. And it gave me my first opportunity to be published. My book talks about growing up with a disability, realizing at a certain point that I'm a minority group. Women have problems with discrimination, so do disabled people. And learning the lessons from other groups who were discriminated against, I could apply it to my group of people. In the book, I think I'm just basically trying to say, I've grown up like many of you. I've had many experiences you've had. Went to college, had my own place, made my own way, and did some interesting things along the way. My experiences in college, I kind of wanted it so disabled people could read it and go, oh, that is a way we can live. You know, we do need to kind of plan these things out and use some support mechanisms from other people in the community. And I wanted people to also, non-disabled people, to see that it was so much similar to their life. So I was very pleased that Temple decided to publish the book. The problem I find, again, is the stigma of disability. People think, oh, well, I don't want to read about something sad. But I was hoping to show people that it's not a different kind of life. There are some things that are different, but mostly it's the same kind of life. If you like memoirs, you should like the book. If you want to know about disability, there's a lot of disability history in it, because some historical things have happened since I've been involved with disability rights. And I kind of thought it was maybe entertaining. The interesting thing about getting it published is that's very difficult. I mean, I don't think any writer could ever say getting something published is not difficult. And I think the reason I continue is because for some reason, and I think this is what drives artists, is they just have to do it. And if you find whatever your art is that you have to do it, you'll do it. You may not have an audience, but you'll do it. I became involved with a committee of the Human Relations Commission, then because of my committee work educating them about the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act. In the 70s, then they wanted me to do more. Once you get a spokesperson, you're going to use them as much as you can, and I ended up being a commissioner. All the time that I was trying to explain to people about discrimination and disability law. That's when I, as I said before, when I realized the stories really worked. Because me telling the story of educating disabled kids as opposed to segregating them, people were able to accept it, and non-disabled people started pushing for disability law. The Human Relations Commission was pivotal for me because it was a civil rights organization. They'd already fought for women, they'd already fought for black people, and now they were starting to fight for disabled people. And having someone like me with a lot of just firsthand experience made it easier for them to understand and make the comparisons between disabled people and other affected populations. I think one of my favorite stories about access is when I was involved with the Kentucky Arts Council, and one of the Arts Council board members was a part of our committees, a civil rights committee. And she was learning all about access, what it meant, audio descriptions, interpreting services, amplification systems. And she was a patron of the arts, had been for years, and a supporter, financial supporter of the arts. And she realized that many of her friends who had been supporters of the arts, financial donators, had quit coming to the theater. And she asked them, why aren't you coming anymore? And one of them said, well, I don't hear so well. And so when I get there and I can't quite hear what's going on, I miss too much. And another artist, another friend of hers said, well, I don't see so well, so sometimes I can't tell what's going on. Well, my friend had been on the Civil Rights Committee, had learned all about accessibility, and realized these people weren't taking advantage of the services that were there for, quote, disabled people, because they weren't, quote, disabled people. They were just older people that couldn't see and hear so well anymore. She talked to them about going back, and they all started coming back to the theater. So when you say you're making your place accessible for disabled people, arts groups need to know they're making their places accessible for their audience today and their audience in the future. A play, a really good play, it speaks to you. It says things in a way you might not thought of before, or it illustrates something that you didn't understand and now you can understand it. It's another level of being, and it's inspirational. It's kind of hard to explain because it is inspirational. And music or plays or poetry or good art. I had a friend who went to an exhibit that I went to. It was the Wendell Cherry exhibit at the Speed Museum. Beautiful, huge pieces of artwork. There was a huge picture of a woman dancer in white robes and beautiful colors and bright. And a friend of mine who was blind went to the exhibit. And when we talked about it later, we found out we both loved the same picture. And she described it to me perfectly. And I thought, if it moves her and she can't see it, then that's what art does. They matter. They're spiritual. I'm Cass Irvin, and I'm a Kentucky artist.